So if folks have any questions as they come up, please pop them into the chat box as Molly's talking, and then at the end, we're going to have a chance to have a conversation. So with that, Molly, we can get started.
Okay, great. I took my video off. I don't know if you want that on for while I'm presenting, just to reduce bandwidth considerations, but let me know.
I think it's fine. Thanks.
Okay, sure. So, as Jen just mentioned, today I'm going to be presenting an overview of the integrated resource and resilience planning for the power sector. And this includes some of the work that ICF did to support the Tanzanian Electric Supply Company, or TANESCO. Next slide. So power sector planning, which is really just periodically looking out over the next 5, 10, or 20-year time horizon to assess future power needs and future investments is really important. And I'd say that in my experience, all too often, new builds and new projects, so new investments can be driven by politics, by donors, with little attention being paid to kind of this more holistic set of evolving priorities. For example, the changing supply and demand characteristics and changing risks. So when planning has been done, the traditional objective in power and other sector planning, and I work a lot in water resources as well, is that traditionally it's the concept of least cost. So meeting, in this case, the demand for electricity for the least cost set of investments. So investments in power sector generation and transmission and distribution and energy efficiency as well. However, the power sector is rapidly evolving and there are emerging new technologies, and I'd say lower and more competitive prices, for example, for renewables are starting to emerge. There's also new and evolving risks. So we see COVID, for example, market risks as well as climate change risks, so increasing flood and storm surge risks and temperature increases, which have kind of cross-cutting impacts on power sector performance. And they're combined with this are new goals and objectives beyond just least cost. So for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is emerging as a priority globally and also for some countries. So all of these can be accounted for as well as cost. And this is really moving away from a least cost type of planning paradigm into a least regrets planning paradigm, where you're accounting for more, more than just cost as you develop and identify the plan that works for you. Slide 3. So integrated resource and resilience planning represents a method for developing a power system investment plan that explicitly addresses risks and resilience concerns. So it identifies and evaluates a range of investment portfolios, new technologies, including cost, reliability, and environmental impacts. It assesses portfolio resiliency against uncertain variables such as climate change, regulatory changes, and it generates a least regrets plan that is robust and resilient under a range of possible futures that reflect inherent risks and uncertainties. So the bottom line is that it should lead to better outcomes as it informs decision making. And in particular, the IRRP framework, so Integrated Resource and Resilience Planning Framework, can assist energy planners to meet competing objectives, including cost reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction, and climate resilience, and to consider trade-offs in long-range planning that aim to scale up energy resources, including clean energy sources. Next slide, please. As a part of least regrets planning, so that's extending this traditional power sector planning, again, of sort of least cost and reliability. Key decision makers have to first identify potential planning objectives. So, for example, in the case of Ghana, we looked at, Ghana, the Ghanaians are interested in reaching 30% renewable generation by 2030. So that's a new objective. And with new objectives, you need to really think through the type of metrics and the type of criteria in order to be able to quantify them. So that's the starting point. What are your objectives? And then you can look at how do you measure them? And so an example of traditional planning here, you see the cost and reliability metrics, but additional criteria under an integrated resource and resilience plan might include resilience to climate risk, the land area use. So in the case of land constrained areas, you might look at the footprint, for example, of solar and your different types of investments there. And then you can also look at environmental considerations, so greenhouse gases and other emissions that might affect air quality in the environment, for example. Next slide. So IRP informs a broad range of decision making and decision makers. So for a regulated utility, regulators, they would benefit from the transparency of the information, and they consider whether rate increases are justified and look to seek the best rate for customers, but at the same time account for the utilities need to recover a fair return on their investments and the incurred expenses that they've had for their investments. So related to that, consumers can gain insight on the competitiveness of the rates that they're paying, and as well the potential changes in the timing of significant investments, which could impact consumer rates, and power availability, which is really important where access is currently low. And they can also get a better sense of the reliability of supply and how that might change. An independent power producer or IPPs or public-private partnerships or developers, basically investors can use an IRP as a basis for investment decisions and better target opportunities, for example, and even location. So for example, targeting specific geographic locations for developing different resource alternatives, for example, distributed solar investments. And then financial investors or banks, they can better understand the physical and the market risks and whether or not the plans are sound. And this is a big thing that we're dealing with in terms of the climate change work that I do. This whole push for transparency and disclosing the physical and transition risks. And so that's really important too. And part of that push is coming from investors. And so they really want to understand, what are the risks as I put financing into these different, the financeability of these different alternatives. So that really, an IRP can also serve to promote investor confidence. And if you look at the government, from particular environmental agencies, they can identify the impact of alternative resource decisions on the environment and how different investment portfolio choices can get them closer or further away from specific goals, such as greenhouse gas emission targets. And so they can also assess the compliance of different portfolios with policies under alternative compliance mechanisms, as well as a sort of technical ability to comply. Grid operators can assess whether different investment strategies within an integrated resource and resilience plan will affect grid operations and reliability going forward. So looking at the loads on the system. And in general, I mean, the IRPs provide needed information to perform grid, system level planning. So when might new builds be necessary? And utilities benefit a lot from the IRPs, and they're big, one of the key stakeholders. And this really helps them to understand how different investment portfolios would perform under a range of risks, and to see the costs and the benefits of different procurement options, and to make decisions about what types of investments they want to be making. So next slide. So I'm going to just pivot and speak more specifically to the application of IRRP in Tanzania, where we had a particular focus on the risk of drought to hydropower, or at least the contribution that my team was making in working with TANESCO. They identified hydropower as one of the the largest risks. So USAID supported the development of an integrated power systems master plan in Tanzania over the years, I think 2015 to 2018, and we supported TANESCO and other key stakeholders to develop an IRP. So you can see from this slide here that Tanzania has historically had high dependence on hydropower, but actually recent developments in natural gas have reduced that dependency quite considerably. So I think in 2003, Tanzania had nearly a 95, 96% reliance on hydropower, and that proportion decreased to 31% more recently. So, while diversification away from hydropower can increase system resilience, there's also trade-offs as continued movement towards higher greenhouse gas emitting and low-cost fuels could increase the challenge of meeting Tanzania's NDC objectives of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 10 to 20% by 2030. There's also been a really high rate of growth in power demand, and at the same time, a low level of access. I think these numbers are a little bit, they're evolving rapidly, a little bit out to date. I looked this morning just to check on that 24% because it seemed really low. And according to the World Bank, the energy access is actually closer to 40% today. So seeing quite an increase in investment and access in energy. And then if you look at that snapshot from the Telegraph, and I'll speak more to this, but Tanzania has faced significant economic impacts during drought years due to their historical high reliability and hydropower. So next slide, please. Again, hydropower has been a large source of electricity. And just, I guess what I want to just highlight here, and that 46% is actually not correct. It's again closer to 31% of generation capacity. These numbers are really changing rapidly, so I need to update my slide decks. But during a drought, and you can see in the bold down there, there are severe consequences. So the cost to the utility can substantially increase, in particular as they substitute in higher cost diesel generation for hydropower. So in this case, $70 million high cost to substitute out from hydro. And then this also results in increased greenhouse gas emissions and reduced economic growth during drought years. Next slide, please. So the goal, or TANESCO's goal, was really to identify a least regrets power sector plan that is robust and resilient and performs the best under a broad range of potential technical, social, and economic futures that reflect risks and inherent uncertainty. So that's the starting point goal. Next slide, please. And here is a snapshot of the framework for IRP, and we've been rethinking how to present this so it's not so confusing. But essentially, the IRP framework assesses the performance and the cost of a range of potential investment portfolio strategies. And those portfolio strategies are developed by TANESCO, and they align with the different goals and objectives. And so you see here the supply side, transmission, and the demand side. So those portfolios would incorporate the existing resources, but also might reflect, different portfolios might reflect different new resources. So hydropower, coal, oil, they might reflect a resource actually we consider is on the demand side as energy efficiency measures and demand side management measures. So it puts these different resources, supplier resources, transmission resources, and demand resources all on an equal playing field. And it assesses the IRP, the performance of the different portfolios under a broad range of sensitivities and scenarios are assessed, and the trade-offs in terms of their performance are assessed to ultimately inform an integrated power sector master plan. So there's a lot of data and modeling that goes into this. Even across, there's a transmission model, there's load forecast models. I'll talk a little bit, if you go to the next slide actually. you can see some of a subset of the models, but the main one is actually the integrated planning model, which is ICF's proprietary model, which is used to examine different portfolio strategies, so power sector portfolio strategies under a range of different scenarios. So in Tanzania, we did apply the IPM model, and we also applied the Stockholm Environmental Institute's WEEP model in order to model the stream flow discharge for Tanzania's main rivers that feed into the key hydropower plants. So the WEEP model also produces information on the total water supply delivered to different sectors and the electricity produced by various hydropower plants. So you can see just an example of the output for, in this case, hydropower generation under a drought and a baseline scenario. So next slide, please. So TANESCO developed 3 portfolio strategies, Portfolio A, B, and C. Portfolio A is the reference scenario, and it's the optimal portfolio for meeting baseline energy demand and transmission development. So this portfolio actually primarily increases hydropower and import capacity from neighboring countries. So the main thing to keep in mind here is, for the purposes of our focus on drought here, but is that this Portfolio A and Portfolio C both include investment in a new large-scale dam called Stiegler's Gorge, which is very, very large. It's about 2.1 gigawatts. Portfolio B is the limited financing portfolio, and this is a scenario where TANESCO begins to use fossil fuel resources to supply the baseload and provides, again, limited financing to large-scale projects. So in this case, a large investment, for example, in Stiegler's Gorge is not feasible. The Portfolio C is otherwise known as a renewables portfolio. And here, TANESCO does invest in the large hydro, Stiegler's Gorge, but also focuses on developing small-scale hydropower and other renewable resources, such as utility-scale wind, solar, and geothermal resources, as well as some smaller-scale biomass. And this is aligned with TANESCO with an objective that by 2036, this portfolio would serve 10% of electricity demand with non-hydro renewables. Next slide, please. So TANESCO wanted to look at a broad range of scenarios, or test their portfolios against a broad range of different scenarios or model sensitivities. So these include, for example, fuel and investment risks, looking at the market and fuel price volatility, climate risks, and we looked at, with TANESCO, a broad range of climate risks, but in particular, they wanted to focus in on drought and hydropower, and then demand side risks, so where rapid demand growth, which is really what we're seeing, might end up stressing the system and increase load shedding, or basically load shedding is like the deliberate shutdown of power to prevent the failure of the entire system, especially when demand strains the capacity. Next slide, please. So related to this, TANESCO identified 7 sensitivities. The first one is the reference, or really baseline, where financing for incremental generation is not constrained. The second one, which we're going to focus a bit more on, is the drought sensitivity, so future hydropower output is limited. The third one is a high load, and actually third and fourth are really moderate and high load scenarios, so looking at a scenario where the demand for energy for power is nearly, in the high load, I think twice that of the baseline scenario. And then the number 5 is the gas pipeline contingency. So as I mentioned at the outset, there's been a lot of investment in natural gas. And in this scenario, natural gas supply is limited due to pipeline outages. The sixth one is that massive hydropower dam, so Stiegler's Gorge experiences an outage or temporarily fails. And then the last one is delayed development, where the Stiegler's Gorge hydropower plant development is delayed by a few years. So again, we're going to explore the drought sensitivity and how the different investment portfolios perform under drought and changes in hydropower, associated changes in hydropower output. So we developed the drought scenario by analyzing historical rainfall, temperatures, and drought duration. And the drought scenario includes a rising temperature signal to reflect climate change from 2016 to 2040. That rising temperature is actually also reflected in historical climate time series. But for this scenario, there's an average annual temperature increase by about 1.5 degrees by 2040. I just say that because the drought scenario is informed by the observed historical climate record. So it represents, and again, actually indicates an increasing temperature trend over the past 40 years. It represents a plausible manifestation of drought in Tanzania. In other words, this type of drought has been experienced in the past. And so you can see the rainfall time series on the right, which reflects about a 5% decline in rainfall for Tanzania under the drought scenario, and an 8% decline in the specific basin where the major hydropower plant, Stiegler's Gorge investment, is being planned. Next slide, please. Here you can see the hydropower generation under the drought and the reference scenarios. And so notably in both scenarios, you'll see that hydropower grows over time as the new capacity comes online. The annual hydropower generation variation is driven, it's driven by new investments in hydropower capacity, again, primarily Stiegler's Gorge, but also interannual inflow variability, so driven by rainfall and temperature variations, and then also competing water demands, and then hydropower generation releases. Here you see that 5% reduction in annual rainfall, and there are other factors as well, demand changes as well, but that translates into a 30% reduction in stream flow and a 12% reduction in hydropower generation. Next slide, please. So this slide I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. So try not to get distracted by, normally this would be an animated slide, so try not to get distracted by all of the text here. I'll go through this quite slowly. So TANUSCO chose 33 different metrics by which they wanted to evaluate the 3 different investment portfolios. The investment portfolios are on the bottom, so that's renewable, limited finance, and business as usual or reference. And so the figure shows the performance of those portfolio strategies with and without drought for a few of, a subset of the 33 selected metrics. And, the bottom line here, after I get through, just sort of describing this, is that this type of analysis allows for the comparison of the different investment strategies, allows for decision makers to consider trade-offs. And this is just for one of the sensitivities. This is just for drought. But how well does a particular investment portfolio perform under different sensitivities? So here you can see, just if you kind of go from left to right, you can see the subset of metrics. So system cost, the net present value of the investment and the system production costs, unserved energy, the average annual unserved energy across all the years, which is a measure of resource adequacy, unmet demand, the amount of water deficit for non-hydropower water users, fuel type diversity. So this is a diversity index where a higher value means less supply diversity. So it's representative of fuel security and reliability. Average annual fuel expense, which shows the variation in variable costs. So this is where I was talking about earlier, how if there is a drought and it affects hydropower, you would have a higher variable cost as you substitute in higher cost resources. So this is a measure of financial risk exposure. And then CO2 emissions, so carbon emissions, which is the average annual carbon emissions for the different portfolios with and without drought. So again, comparing the performance of the different portfolios allows the planners to really kind of dig into some of these differences and consider the trade-offs. And just a high-level summary, because I realize there's a lot of information. For the limited finance scenario, which is in blue, it has lower system costs and less sensitivity to drought, due in part because there's been lower investment in large hydropower. But the high reliability on one fuel source is clear there, as well as the high emissions. For renewables, for that scenario, which is in red, it's a higher cost scenario, but it also has high fuel diversity and lower carbon emissions. And it does have high sensitivity to drought. So you see an increase in unserved energy. For the reference scenario, which is in green, it performs really similarly to the renewable energy, I think in part due to this large hydropower investment, but has slightly lower costs than the renewable strategy, and is slightly more reliable under the drought conditions. But fuel costs for both of the hydro-dependent scenarios increase under drought, so you can see that fuel expense, as do emissions, as higher emitting greenhouse gas fuels are substituted in. Next slide, please. So here you can see that the three scenarios, Portfolio A and Portfolio C, are the ones where hydropower investments are made. The large hydropower investment is made. And so you can see the cost for the different portfolios, Portfolio B being limited finances in red. You can see very clearly the cost. So there's a very high capital cost to this hydropower plant, the Stiegler's Gorge. So you can see that cost go up considerably. Whereas in the limited finance investment portfolio B, there's an incremental sort of smaller scale investment over time. However, once this massive capital investment in hydropower is made, the incremental operational costs over time for those are less. So it's why the lines start to begin to converge, because operating a hydropower plant is cheaper than the other, than under the limited finance for oil. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this slide shows the greenhouse gas emissions reductions for each individual portfolio. So from the beginning, 2016, to the end year, 2040, under the different sensitivity scenarios. So this is a little bit different than what we were just looking at, because you're comparing across a single scenario. The table, and I also want to just point out that the table and the figure show the same information, but just in different ways. So TANESCO had a goal of moving away from high-cost fossil fuel resources for several reasons, and one of them included, the desire to move to more environmentally sustainable resources. To measure the performance toward this goal, the change in carbon intensity from the initial year through to the end of the study period, or through the end of the study period, so 2016 to 2040, was considered for each portfolio. Now, I just want to point out here that it's important to note that Portfolio B, which doesn't have that massive investment in hydropower, has a much greater absolute greenhouse gas emissions value than Portfolio A or C. So what you're seeing is actually just a change within a specific scenario of greenhouse gas emissions under different scenarios or different sensitivities. So from the top table, you can see that all portfolios, all the investment portfolios result in a decrease in carbon intensity, which was the objective of TANESCO, so a relative decrease in carbon intensity, which is caused by increased investments in zero or lower emissions generation, including hydropower and other renewables, and then in the case of limited finance, moving towards more efficient natural gas-fired generation and away from coal. So as you might expect, the best the best performing portfolios with the greatest emissions reductions in this case. Against this metric are those that are more dominantly sourcing hydro and renewable generation. In the bottom figure, which shows the same information as the top figure, you can see more clearly that the major driver of greenhouse gas emission change across the scenarios has to do with the load scenarios. So there's less reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for higher power demand for the portfolios, as the higher emitting fuels are needed to help address higher loads. At the same time, the larger hydropower resource, so portfolios A and C, so that's, I don't know if you can see my cursor, I haven't been using it much, but A and C, the hydropower resource buffers those portfolios to some extent under the highest load sensitivity scenario. I'm gonna have you skip the next slide, because I explained that. Okay, and then so TANESCO considered the performance of the portfolios under a broad range of sensitivities, and they ended up choosing portfolio A, which is the reference portfolio. And that portfolio ranked first in the performance assessment across all 33 metrics and across all of the sensitivities, and had the least financial risk exposure and the most balanced mix of generation sources, and also had lower greenhouse gas emissions and limited financing portfolio. However, as we noted here in the past few slides, it is highly sensitive to drought. But the outcome is that the development of a power sector master plan that includes several components as outlined here. So short, medium, and long-term action plans for implementation, regulatory and policy changes if needed to achieve that portfolio, a procurement and a financial action plan, infrastructure and resilience planning and coordination across government entities, and then an implementation, monitoring, and evaluation plan. And then I'll speak to this at the end, or that particular box at the end, but it's really important to revisit the IRP process and action plans over time as conditions change. Next slide. So the key takeaway is that integrating climate risk management into power planning and projects can help power planners and investors better understand implications and manage climate risks. And I would also say in the context here, not just climate risk, but also the ability to meet low emissions objectives over time can really be concretely considered within this type of planning framework. So again, in this case, we saw how drought can increase greenhouse gas emissions if reductions in hydropower generation are compensated for by increased use of fossil fuel-based resources. So that's something that we pointed out in the analysis. And in fact, the impact of drought and increased temperatures could also be even greater if their effects on power generation by other renewable energy resources, biomass and solar, are also taken into consideration. But I think what I want to point out is that identifying those kind of risks as being inherent to a hydropower dominated system is really important, because it means that Tanzania can, and they are, look at solutions such as adapting hydropower operations during drought, improving water use efficiency, and even adapting the hydropower design to take into consideration climate change. So, for example, measures to improve water use efficiency could include improved irrigation practice and even siting of irrigation downstream of hydropower plants, and then better regulation such as better monitoring of water withdrawals and enforcement. And in particular in Tanzania, enforcement of penalties for illegal water abstraction could really help reduce some of the stress on water resources during the dry season. So it's also, helping them to think through how, not just the impacts, but how you might manage the impacts of drought. Next slide. This is my last slide. So again, integrated resource and resilience planning is a process, and it's not a one size fits all, that's for sure. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of context that comes into play here, and stakeholder priorities are a very important part of this process. I didn't stress that enough actually during this presentation, just how important engagement of a broad range of stakeholders is from the outset, and that's a big core component of an IRRP. This is a process, an IRRP is a process that should be undertaken every 2 to 3 years and really be iterative. And by being iterative in that sense, you can better account for the changing cost and performance characteristics of technologies. Again, we see a very steep drop in some of the renewable technologies. You can also look at changes in demand and try and incorporate them into an updated plan. So I think I'll end it there, but yeah, thank you for your time and listening. Let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Molly. So we do have a few minutes to talk about looking at climate risk in the energy sector and to ask Molly any questions anyone might have. If folks have a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself, pop your video on if you'd like to ask a question. If you're more comfortable, feel free to put it in the chat box. And maybe I can even start us out, Molly. I'm curious about other ways to look at climate risk in IRRP, or other types of climate risk that one could potentially look at in IRRP other than hydropower. Are there other things, potential long-term climate changes or climatic impacts that you've looked at through this process?
Oh, and that's a great question, Jen. Yes, in fact, actually, we did look at a very broad range of climate impacts. So we looked at, first of all, you have a big system. So each of the components are sensitive to different climate risks, right? So you have the demand. So you can see, although cooling technology, so air conditioning is not, it's not a large penetration of air conditioning in Tanzania right now. That is actually growing significantly. So as you start to see the demand for cooling increase as temperature increases, you can also see, an increase in energy consumption from those cooling technologies. So energy demand can be affected by temperature for sure. And temperature increases, longer term temperature increases, as well as more acute stresses like shorter term heat waves can have a big effect on the system, because high temperature affects the efficiency of transmission and distribution, substations, thermal generation. So we did actually consider with TANESCO looking at the cross-cutting impacts of temperature in a more rigorous way, but that is in their integrated power system master plan. So many of these other risks, for example, sea level rise and the location of coastal infrastructure and storm surge is also a large risk. Not as big as, if you're thinking of Tanzania, which is neighboring Mozambique. Mozambique has are much more exposed to, let's say, tropical cyclones in Tanzania, but sea level rise, the incremental sea level rise also poses a potential threat to some of the lower lying coastal infrastructure. So, I mean, I could go on. There are quite a few, I guess, acute and longer term hazards that should be accounted for in power system planning. And in this case, we took a prioritization exercise with Tanzania and with TANESCO, and really their biggest concern was drought, and then followed up by flood risk, in particular riverine flood risk, including like sedimentation into hydropower plants, which reduces the capacity of those plants and also can damage infrastructure where they have trouble accessing certain hydropower plants because roads are destroyed. So there's really quite a bit to look at in that space.
I'm curious how the linkages were made between, or if linkages were made between the NDC targets in Tanzania and the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and this IRRP process? Is that something that the stakeholders decided that they wanted to look at, or how was that taken into account? Because I think a lot of folks here who are part of this training are really trying to think about their long-term strategy planning, the greenhouse gas emissions planning into the future, and how they would kind of link the sectors together or link that LTS or NDC to the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the renewable strategy reflected was, basically an outgrowth of the NDC ambition to have 10% increase in non-hydro renewables. And so that was definitely built into one of the 3 portfolio strategies that they examined. And so, certainly, at the end of the day, they didn't choose the renewable strategy. That doesn't mean that there weren't investments in renewables in the reference strategy that they chose. If you consider a large hydro and actually smaller hydropower investments to be within that category of greenhouse gas reducing technologies, they did achieve some reductions, even that slide that I showed you where there is reductions across the board for all strategies as they move away from coal. But I do think that one of the constraints is just financing. Even though you move away from a kind of least cost paradigm and you try and account for these different priorities, it's still a pretty tough hurdle to overcome when you have indigenous coal resources that can be tapped into for much lower costs. So I think that's always going to be a sort of structural challenge that's faced in some of these countries as they have to expand to be able to, provide energy security. It's a very real, it's a very real trade-off, I guess.
Great. So we have a lot of folks actually from the Caribbean here in this call, and I'm wondering if anyone has any perspective that they'd like to share if they are looking at things like sea level rise or tropical cyclones, especially in your planning, in your power sector planning, or if that's something that has yet to be considered. I know we have Trinidad and Tobago and Bahamas here in this session. I think folks don't want to talk.
Well,
okay. Maybe I can jump in, or maybe there's someone else. I'll yield and then I'll come back if someone wants to say something. No? All right. Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Molly. Very good presentation. I think it captured all the essentials for looking at sensitivities and long-term planning in the power sector. I just wanted to add that Trinidad and Tobago, we are part of a regional project now that is developing an IRP for Trinidad and Tobago specifically. And I just wanted to highlight the point that you made and to really stress that there's no one-size-fits-all for these approaches. Because even at the national level, you get more nuanced considerations regarding even at a micro scale, the location of your plant, which may be sensitive to sea level rise other than other locations, for example. But just to say that we are approaching it in pretty much the same way in terms of identifying the sensitivities. For us, the cyclones or hurricanes and extreme events would be of course uppermost in our minds. Even though Trinidad and Tobago, unlike Bahamas, perhaps and they can come in, we're a little bit to the southern edge of the hurricane belt, and therefore we get for want of a better word, less hit. But that does not mean that we are immune, because we do get extreme localized events in between due to convectional heating and very gusty winds sometimes outside of the hurricane belt. So I just wanted to add and just support that approach in terms of identifying all of the issues and the climate sensitivities. We're also looking at issues related to climate, to temperature increases in terms of how that may affect the efficiency of electricity production, for example, using solar, for example. or things related to transmission issues and things like that. So we're looking at all of the climate impacts from a parameter perspective: sea level rise, temperature, flooding, and intense rainfall, because it will have impact on the physical setting of where you may want to put the plant, for example, a solar plant or wind or whatever it is, and as well on issues related to drought, accessibilities, and things like that. So it requires an overall holistic approach, but also identifying some of the secondary and tertiary impacts of the climate, specific climate impacts for sea level rise, for example. While you might have inundation directly from the coast, you may also have that contributing to more severe levels of flooding as a result of drainage issues, for example. So while we look at things separately, we also look at their nuanced impacts and whether they're synergistic or whether they cancel out. So I want to support the approach and just to say that it's consistent with some of the things that we are also doing in assessing some of the climate sensitivities. Thank you.
Wow. I'd love to hear more about the IRP, and if there's anything you could share, that would be great. I know, Trinidad, well, from what I understand, that most of the countries in the region, or Eastern and Southern Caribbean region in particular, are highly dependent on imported fossil fuels and have high energy costs. And so there's this push for energy security, but Trinidad is a bit, energy is much cheaper because you're a major producer and exporter of LNG, or liquefied natural gas and oil. But I think there is this push within Caribbean countries to kind of move towards energy security. And I've had some recent discussions with folks in Barbados where there's a real high potential. I think in all of many countries, there's a high potential for solar voltaic energy. And like in Barbados in particular, they have a new program that's called, I think it's called Ridge to Reefs, but they're dedicating, I think, $1 billion over the next 10 years to build resilience. But one of the issues, and to move towards net carbon zero emissions, one of the issues that, and many of the issues, but one of them is just the lack of flexibility in a small island setting. So, there's limited land resources. And so we were talking about, the person I was talking to was talking about how they were going to be fortifying household roofs with solar, and but there's this big concern with hurricanes, like how do you hurricane proof solar resources? And so I think there's maybe a lot of lessons to be learned, I think, even from, like, say, Puerto Rico, and how to build solar power, and maybe there's some limitations, like if a hurricane category 5 comes through, then maybe, I don't know, like, can you build to that, or is it too expensive? So I think a lot of these trade-offs and these in terms of costs, really, I think they haven't been that well articulated, and you've seen or taken into account, and you see big investments in solar farms, for example, I think in Belize, where a storm comes through and that investment is wiped out. So what we're trying to do up front is to account for those kind of risks and costs to be a little bit more realistic and sustainable in terms of investments.
That's great. I think we have a potential connection. I'm happy to connect our Trinidad and Tobago folks and Mali together. I think I would also like to hear a lot more about the IRP work going on there. I didn't know that was happening. So I think
World Bank funded. May I ask?
Sorry. Hello. Yeah, I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Is that through the World Bank support, or is there?
I can't say for sure. It's through a regional program, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency.
Okay.
Yeah. So but it could be World Bank.
Okay.
Let me just check. I think
that would be great to know.
Yeah, it's GIZ as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to wrap up here. We have to head back into the main session. I hate to cut this great discussion off. So I pasted if folks don't still have the main session open, I repasted the link here. Otherwise, if people don't mind, you can close this out. And thank you so much, Molly. This was really interesting. And I think we'll have a lot of follow-up for you after this. And hopefully we can also chat more with Kishan about the work that they're doing in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yep, thanks everybody.
Thank you.